Today's story is a chilling, unfathomable tale that will make you terrified to eat meat sourced from small towns. Stay with us while we uncover the facts behind Canada's worst serial killer and find out how he earned this title. In the archives of true crime history, few cases have been as chilling and haunting as the Robert Pickton murders. These gruesome crimes have left a trail of despair and horror that shocked the nation. Today, we will dive into the twisted mind of Robert Pickton and the women he tormented and murdered for over a decade in the small town of Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. Like they always say, it's the quiet ones you've got to watch out for, and Robert Pickton was no exception. Quiet, reserved, and seemingly well-behaved, Willie was the last person authorities would assume was a maniacal serial killer. But behind the simple farm life exterior was a madman with a dark, twisted secret who went undetected in his serial killing spree for years. He was someone who no one would suspect was butchering women as his nightly bedtime routine. Robert William Pickton was born on October 24, 1949 in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, Canada, and grew up in a pig farming family in the small town. Seemingly average, his childhood would reveal a twisted history that would inevitably give birth to Canada's worst serial killer. Pickton was a meek, timid child who would often hide in the gutted carcasses of hogs to avoid people, displaying poor social skills. Pickton also had a debilitating fear of water and refused to bathe, constantly reeking of rotting animals and dirt. His clothes, never cleaned, assisted his aroma of decomposition and despair, shielding him with a comfortable 10-foot radius from anyone who smelt him coming. Naturally, Pickton was shunned by the kids at school and grew up isolated and alone, the perfect cocktail for any growing serial killer. But what happened in the afternoon of October 16, 1967 would solidify his fate and the fate of the women he would encounter. Pickton would often express the deep scars that he bore from his family growing up. One event he would often repeat was his mother slaughtering his pet pig when he was a small child. Mrs. Pickton was a cruel woman, displaying no remorse or affection to the children, but the events of October 16, 1967 would be the ultimate imprint she left on Willie, grooming him into the serial killer to come. Willie was aware of his mother's disregard for the life of animals, but on that brisk fall morning, Willie would become acutely aware of her stance on human life as well, changing the trajectory of his life forever. Willie's younger brother Dave was just learning to drive. Excited about having recently acquired his license, Dave had taken his father's red truck into town. Along that road was the 14-year-old neighborhood boy, Tim Barrett. The details of how it happened and Dave's intentions were unclear, but in a moment, Dave slammed into Tim. Immediately, Dave fled the scene and raced home to get his mother, who returned with him. Mrs. Pickton proceeded to roll the agonizing, paralyzed Tim into the slough on the edge of the road, face down in a puddle of water. Tim would be found the following day, dead in the slough on the side of the road, shoes still splayed on the roadside. Willie would often recount this event when speaking to police years later, indicating this as the beginning of his disregard towards human life. At the time, police never investigated the murder, which we will find to be a common theme in this tale, further adding to his lack of regard for the consequences of murder. Willie's reign of terror ran between 1995 and 2001, luring numerous women to his farm, often bribing them with drugs and alcohol. Many of these women were sex workers from Vancouver's downtown east side, a neighborhood notorious for its drug and sex trade. Pickton would then sexually assault and murder them, feeding their remains to the pigs on the farm to dispose of the evidence. The same pigs that would be slaughtered and sold back to the town as packaged meat. Could you imagine finding out you may have possibly eaten your loved one in your tacos? The exact number of Pickton's victims remains unknown, but it is believed that he may have killed as many as 49 women. He targeted vulnerable individuals who were often marginalized and living on the fringes of society, which allowed him to continue his reign of terror for several years. Pickton would often exploit his victims, offering drugs and partying at the Piggy Palace, an old converted barn house on the property owned by Pickton and his brother Dave, used to lure in his victims with promises of drugs and good times. Operating under the ruse of a not-for-profit organization, seeing as many as 1,800 participants at any given time, the killer had ample prey for the taking. One victim in particular, Ellingson, stood out from his typical routine and was offered employment and board on the farm, managing the books for the business and administrative duties. Ellingson would often go for drives with Pickton to pick up drugs and prostitutes in the east side. One night in particular, Ellingson would bear witness to a gruesome discovery on the farm that would forever haunt her dreams. This particular evening started like every other. They went for a drive, picked up drugs and prostitutes. Upon returning, Ellingson smoked some crack and Pickton went to his quarters with his prostitute. Hours later, Ellingson would be awoken by loud noises in the barn and an unusual light. She went outside to investigate and was overcome with a gut-wrenching feeling as she approached the barn. Little did she know this sensation was nothing compared to the emotional turmoil she would experience moments later. Ellingson proceeded into the barn to find the same prostitute they just picked up hanging from a hook, as if she was one of the livestock on the farm. Pickton, the almighty pig lord himself, quickly grabbed her, pulling her aside, forcing her to look at the dangling woman. Covered in blood, he warned her if she ever told anyone what she saw, he would do the same to her, and she believed it. Ellingson's testimony in court would end up being inadmissible, stating her drug use made her testimony unreliable. Growing more daring with each abduction, Pickton continued his tirade upon the prostitutes of East Poco, but the more comfortable he became, the sloppier he got. Truly believing he was untouchable from his lifelong experiences with murder, he continued his abductions, grabbing Wendy Eistetter next. Once back at the property, a fight ensued between Pickton and Wendy. Pickton, attempting to handcuff Wendy to the bed, let his guard down when he heard a noise in the hallway, and Wendy, acting quickly, got hold of his knife, stabbing him multiple times. Wendy fled the property and was picked up naked and bloody on the highway. Given the small population of Port Coquitlam, Wendy would end up at the same emergency department as Pickton. Pickton arrived with the keys to Wendy's handcuffs in his pocket and was never questioned about it. Once again, this was never investigated by the police as to why Pickton arrived with injuries and the keys to Wendy's handcuffs. Another massive fail for the police. Pickton's crimes would eventually come to light in 2002 when he was arrested for illegal firearms possession. Key witness Bill Hiscox would describe the farm as a creepy-looking place, patrolled by a 600-pound boar. Bill described the boar as a vicious dog that would chase and bite at people who approached the farm. Bill advised police that Pickton kept all the purses and IDs in his trailer for the missing women, which would become crucial evidence in his conviction. During a search of his property, investigators discovered the personal items and identification belonging to missing women. As a result, the police launched a more extensive investigation into his activities. The investigation into the Pickton case was fraught with controversy and criticism. It raised serious questions about the way law enforcement handles cases involving marginalized individuals. Many of the victims were Indigenous women, further underscoring the systemic issues facing Canada's Indigenous communities. Despite evidence pointing to Pickton's involvement in the disappearances, he was not initially charged with murder. Instead, he faced charges related to the illegal possession of firearms and was held in custody. Another giant miss for the police, but this time he was at least off the streets. As more information continued to emerge about the gruesome details of the crimes, and the police faced mounting pressure to bring Pickton to justice. The Picktons, sensing the end was near, sold off the majority of the farm, keeping a 6.5-acre piece of land to continue their dirty work. The investigation into the Pickton farm was one of the most extensive in history, covering 280,000 cubic meters of sifted soil and continuing for 21 months. Remains were found all throughout the farm, painting a gruesome story of the horrors these women endured and the scar forever etched into this small town. In 2007, Robert Pickton was finally put on trial for 6 counts of second-degree murder, but the prosecution believed he was responsible for many more deaths. The trial was a lengthy and grueling process, with evidence that was often too disturbing for jurors to handle. Pickton's only regret? That he never made it to an even 50 murders, being apprehended at 49.